Fränken button, you can introduce our guests.
Okay.
Again, thank you, Philip.
Thank you, Philip. Okay, good afternoon. Today we have Jan-Philipp Fränken from the University of Edinburgh. He is a third-year PhD student at the University of Edinburgh, working in the Computational Cognitive Science Lab. He is broadly interested in building human-like intelligent machines and multi-agent environments for collective problem solving. He also holds an MSc degree in Cognitive and Decision Sciences from University College London. Yeah, I think you can start your presentation now, Philip.
Okay, thanks so much for the introduction. I'm very, very honored to be here. Just very briefly, this work I'm presenting is a collaborative project, so I just want to give some credit to the other people which were working with me. One of them is a good friend of mine, Nikos, who is a software engineer. He just finished his PhD this year, actually. The other person is my supervisor, Neil, who also contributed a lot to the conceptual bits of the work and helped a lot with the guidance, the write-up and everything. And he's the PI at the Computational Cognitive Science Lab, actually. And then, yeah, finally myself, as of today, third-year PhD student. Yeah, this is a brief overview of how the talk is structured. So I'm spending some time to motivate the work and talk a bit about the background, which I believe is necessary because it's not a mainstream machine learning or psychology project, but rather it tries to synthesize different approaches and then kind of evaluate different models in an empirical context. So I spent some time motivating things before actually going into the learning problem and the algorithmic analysis. And then I have quite a lot of behavioral results, but depending on the time, I might skip some of them because they're all pointing in sort of the same direction, but I just have them in there from completion. And in the end, I'll just contrast some models and talk a bit about limitations in future directions. I think it's okay if you interrupt me anytime if you have like clarification questions for like bigger or higher level discussion points. I would prefer if we wait until the end just to make sure we not run out of time in the middle of the talk. Great, then let's get started. So just to zoom out a bit, in general, this work is, you can kind of put it into the realm of symbolic AI to some extent. So I'm not going to do any kind of sub-symbolic or distributed whatever processing analysis in this kind of work, but we basically assume in this work that the perceptual part is solved. So all our analysis is on an object-based level, so to speak, meaning that people and also the computer algorithms we're using represent things as concepts or objects. That's kind of the domain we're looking into. So I gave a couple of examples here. For example, what could be objects? They could be geometric shapes such as triangles or rectangles, and they can have different properties such as color and size. So that's pretty much the kind of domain we're looking into in this work, and you will see later in the experiment why this is relevant for introducing it. So yeah, assuming we're working with symbolic concept in this talk, one very important thing I want to mention quite early in the talk is that if you are able to represent things as concepts, you might be able to generate new concepts from simple concepts, such as the compound concept on the right. You can create a red triangle in your mind from the properties defined on the left. So there's this compositional component here, which is very important for the task and other things later in the talk. So if there are no questions, I'm just going to slowly move forward. So what is very important is if you think about as being an agent, be it an artificial agent or a human agent, you might perceive the environment in an object-oriented way after having solved this perceptual part where you need to extract objects from pixel input. Again, that's the level what we're looking at. And I just put some example scenes on the left, which you can think about as different two-dimensional environments where you have a different configuration of objects in each of these scenes. So you can see, for example, at the first scene, there a set of objects is one red object and one blue object. The second scene has one blue object. The third scene has one red object, and the fourth scene has actually two red objects. So that's basically the things we're interested in here in this talk is basically different configuration of objects in the environment, and then linking these configurations to something I'll explain in a bit, but basically that's sort of our data we're looking here. So one nice thing that once we basically have reached this stage where we're able to represent things as concepts, we can use a formalism called lambda abstraction to bind variables or properties to variables. So for people who are not familiar with lambda abstraction, I put an example here on the right of a concept expressed in English language, which just states there exists something red, such as there exists a red triangle. And below that, I tried to translate it into lambda abstraction. So the nice thing about lambda abstraction now, if you look at the expression, is it basically states that there exists something which is of red color in the set X. So the nice part about this is you can now as input take the set on the left. You can feed it into this expression in any kind of programming language. For example, Python, this above should be very similar to the Python syntax. And then you can return a true or false value. In this case, it would be a 1 because there exists a red object for the scene on the left. Please interrupt me if that's not clear how the scene translates into the class on the right. But assuming that this is the truth, basically you can evaluate the data you're having in the scene, feed the set into the lambda expression, and then you basically get an output value. So yeah, assuming that this is the true concept, actually, if we would apply this to the second scene, we would return a false statement or a 0 class label because we don't have a red object in this scene. And then we can go on for the other 2 examples, and they would also both return a true value because in both of them, the proposition we're having here that there exists something red is satisfied. In the last scene, it's important we have 2 different objects. However, they still satisfy the simple expression that there exists something red because I wasn't yet specific about the amount of objects I'm having in the scene. So that's an important thing to pay attention because in a later part of the talk, we can see that actually different numbers of objects might also play a role. Great, so that's basically the formalism we're using in this talk. We have lambda abstraction to bind properties to variables, and we can use English language translated into lambda abstractions to make statements about the environment. Now, what I just explained is basically it's a pretty old idea dating back to the 80s.
Philip, may I ask a question about the previous? So here, I think the capital X refers to the set, and
Exactly.
X1 is just one of the elements, or it refers to a certain element of the set?
Exactly. Yeah, that's a good question. So the way you think about it is exactly like you have labels for the variables. So X1 would be one variable in the set. I could also have a more complex expression where I'm referring to 2 variables, and then I would have an X2 for the second variable. So yeah, that's true, exactly. You could also label it differently. I'll just try to find a label that's intuitive for the present talk like that. You will find different ways of expressing it. Yeah, so and basically what I just described is has been attributed to a field called language of thought, which is basically a field in I'm not even sure if it's psychology or if it's more like cognitive science. We try to think about a system, a formal system that's compositional and rule based, that allows you to generate any arbitrary expression about the environment by recombining simple concepts to construct richer ones, and then you can evaluate them against the environment. So that's actually a pretty old idea. It's nothing we came up with just recently. So yeah, but basically I just wanted to give a brief introduction to it before going into the task. Now there's one problem, just having these, I'm just going back to the slide, just being able to represent things as concepts in this way doesn't really help us addressing the research questions we had, is how people actually come up with these concepts and how do they adapt them given new data. So what we're still missing is some kind of machinery that allows us to evaluate the fitness of these concepts compared to other concepts. And this is where the second relevant background component comes into, which is probabilistic inference. So what we also need before we can go into the problems we are studying, we need to have some kind of background idea about how can we evaluate the fitness of a concept such there exists something red. Why is this better than a concept, for example, that says there exists something red and small, or there exists exactly one red object? So all these kind of 3 concepts, which are kind of similar, will lead to different prediction if you take data and evaluate these concepts. So somehow you have to have some mechanism that allows you to contrast these different contexts. And the standard approach in the literature is use probabilistic inference, specifically Bayesian inference, where in a nutshell, basically, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about it, but what you're doing is basically you contrast different concepts by means of their fitness, where the fitness can be defined as the ratio of the complexity of a concept. In this case, it might be as simple that a shorter concept or a shorter expression is less complex than a longer expression. It's more likely to be generated than a more complex expression, and the likelihood of your data given your concept. So that's the other crucial term here. So what's the likelihood of observing your data given the statement that you have generated? And I will explain both points with examples in the next 2 slides. But just on a high level picture, if we have these 2 features of concepts, we can actually go around the world as an algorithm, generate concepts, evaluate them in terms of their fitness, and then replace a current concept with a better version. So how does this look? Oh, sorry. By the way, the generation procedure is quite complex, so I don't want you to worry too much about it. I just included it for to just round up the picture. But the generation procedure, how it works in general is that you specify some sort of grammar where you start with a symbol, and then you rewrite this symbol and replace subparts of the new symbol with components that are present in your grammar. So for example, I gave an example on the next slide. If you just look at the first column of this table here, you see the start S. So this is a symbol. This is arbitrary, by the way, just for this present context. But basically the way this works is you start with something arbitrary, such as a string called S, and then you can replace this string with different alternatives. Again, don't worry about the different details. I'm just having this in here for those which are interested, probably pausing the video if they watch on YouTube. But I gave a specific example about how this works. Is, for example, if you start with something like S, then you can sample something to replace S, which then becomes your start point for the next thing. So these are called non-terminals. And you keep on sampling new things to replace things in a non-terminal statement until you arrive at the valid lambda expression, so to speak. So again, this procedure it takes some time to get your head around it, but the only reason why I included this is basically, obviously, as you have more components in a concept, you will have more sampling steps, which makes the concept more complex and hence decreases the probability that you can come up with these concepts. So the idea basically is having this generation procedure, you can get different probabilities of creating different concepts, which gives us one part for the evaluation procedure. Exactly, that's pretty much it. And then the next thing we still have to look at is the likelihood of our data given our concept. So I'm back to the same example I showed in the beginning. If we look at our concept here, it's exactly the same we had in the beginning. And let's assume the ground truth is that there exists one red object. Now, if we look at our concepts, and the class in this case is the ground truth, we can then compute the probability of our data given the concept based on the truth and the evaluation that our concept returns for the scene. So if we carefully look at the first row entry here, again, our concept is that there exists something red. The ground truth is, which I wrote on top of it, is that there exists something red. So the label or concept assigns to the scene we have as input will be the same as the ground truth. And in this case, our likelihood will be 1 for this specific expression. And maybe it doesn't make too much sense just yet, but just to make sure, just as another example, imagine now the true was that there exists exactly one red object. So that would mean we can only have one red. We cannot have more than one red. In this case, our class would actually return 0 for the scene example on the bottom, because here we have 2 red. And this means this is actually not following the ground truth anymore. And now if we take our concept again, or guess here on the left, which just said there just is something red, in this case, it would have a likelihood of 0 because it would label this scene as something positive while the ground truth doesn't. So I hope this wasn't overwhelming. I just wanted to give a brief summary of the 2 key components for the evaluation and the algorithmic analysis, which are likelihood of data given concepts and the generation probability of concepts. And obviously here in this example, I assumed the deterministic likelihoods. And obviously you will have to have different kind of likelihoods in the analysis, but I think for the intuitive example, this one was hopefully helpful. So just to wrap up the background section of this talk, again, we need some kind of way of representing concepts. We get this from lambda abstraction, which is kind of part of this language of thought domain. And then we need some kind of inference machinery to evaluate concepts and contrast them as we go along. And this is also called program induction. That's a more recent name for this kind of field in AI, where you basically combine probabilistic inference with symbolic concept representations to basically generate concepts and evaluate statements. Do you have any clarification questions about this at this stage? Okay. Okay, great. This was basically the technical part. Now I'm going to talk about the motivation of our work. So probably familiar to most of you might be the three-level hypothesis from Marr. It's also something coming from the 80s, from cognitive science, which basically distinguishes different levels of analysis you can apply to pretty much any system like intelligence or even like car driving, whatever it is. The first level being the purpose of a system. And in our case, this could be learning concepts. So we are working on a system that learns concepts. The second level being the algorithmic level, which is more about the underlying mechanisms. You can think about it like a recipe, like how does the system actually learn concepts or adapt concepts? And finally, there's a thing called implementation level, which is more like how is the stuff implemented? In a computer, this could be wires or bits, and in the brain, it could be something like neurons, etc. So this is a very old idea. However, I just included here this slide just to make sure we all know what we're looking at. So in machine learning, people are often interested at in the computation level, finding optimal solutions to solve problems. Whereas in computational cognitive science, you're sometimes more interested in the algorithmic level in the sense that you want to understand how human learners do specific things and understand the underlying mechanisms they're using to solve things. You're less interested in necessarily finding ideal solutions, but rather characterize human behavior. So this talk is sort of targeting the algorithmic level or works targeting the algorithmic level. And why is this relevant? Again, the computational level has been studied extensively in this field. So program induction, which is again, language of thought times kind of probabilistic inference, so to speak, has been proven to be a powerful account of concept learning across a variety of domains. So I just highlighted a few sources here. It's by no means an exhaustive list, but it could be Boolean concept learning, numerical concept learning, visual concepts, asking questions, or language learning in general. These are all like just examples of where program induction has provided very powerful account on the computation level. So various AI people have solved difficult problems using program induction, and it seems to work very well. However, there's one big problem here. If we think about the process of generating concepts again, and the realm of possible concepts we can have, even if it's something very simple, such as shapes and colors, per definition, this space of concepts that we can generate is intractable, it's infinite, because we can come up with any kind of concept for using this generation procedure. Just as an example, we can generate something that exists a red object. We can also say that exists a red object and a blue object. And we might also be able to say something that exists a red object, which is larger than a blue object. And we can generate more complex concepts as we go along. So there's an infinite space of concepts that we can kind of generate and evaluate in almost every problem. And the problem is, for a human learner with bounded computational resources, it seems quite of almost like a stupid idea that we walk around and generate millions of concepts to understand the environment. So talking about this algorithmic level, again, very interested in the mechanisms underlying concept learning. This talk basically, and the research we did, was trying to understand what might be these underlying mechanisms of concept learning and adaptation in humans, considering that they're limited in terms of their computational resources. And this is basically just summarizing in what I said. So far, most of these models I presented were interested in the computation level, and we are more interested in trying to figure out the kind of recipe on the algorithmic level. So yeah, that brings us to the main goal of this talk. So what we're doing is we investigate the idea that human concept learning or concept inference utilizes local incremental search. What this means is that we do not exhaustively search for all possible concepts when we're exposed to a problem, but rather we incrementally adapt our best guesses as new data arrives. Just to give an example of this, imagine we are, back to the example a few slides ago, we have a concept such as there's something red. Now we encounter a new data point, which when we evaluate a concept against this data point, it returns false. So we see that our concept is not correct. Now the idea is, instead of now generating millions of new concepts and trying which one might be correct for the new data point, we might just adapt the one that we already have slightly in order to fit the new data we see. So we have some kind of anchoring in the initial element, and given new data, we adapt it to account for the new data, but we don't just abort everything we just had in advance. So it's a pretty simple idea, actually, if you think about it like this, and something that might be relatively plausible. However, it's quite difficult to study in this context. And just to take away some of the empirical results already, we actually can prove this idea empirically. So we find that people are adapting concepts and that they're anchored to their initial concepts across 2 different experiments. And we can also prove this in a model comparison we have later. Okay. Yeah, and just to give some credits to other authors, obviously we didn't invent the idea of local incremental search. It's something that has been out there for a while, and there are different algorithms such as hill climbing or MCMC-like search, which are just different ways of adapting something you have to arrive at a better solution without basically searching the whole space available. And so you can think about this almost like heuristics, although MCMC-like search is not a heuristic, but you can think about it still in a way as something that helps you to improve without going beyond your computational capacities. By the way, I don't know where the boat is here. I think I wanted to say something else, but I'm just going to skip it. I don't want to confuse people. Great. So having covered the background and motivation, I'm now just going to talk about the learning problem of the task, which will be very similar to what we already encountered. So what we did is we took this game Zendo, which actually exists, it's a board game, and turned it into an experiment, an online experiment. So how this game works is basically that you imagine that you're a scientist traveling to a strange planet. And on this planet, you're exposed to different configuration of objects. In this case, these are all triangles, or also called cones. And you need to figure out which configuration of triangles follows a strange rule. So for us, this is just a way to say this is the ground truth that evaluates true or false, but to make it more engaging for people, we would tell them, okay, this is actually something that emits radiation, this hidden rule. So yeah, this is just basically the setup to make it more engaging for people. And to give a few more examples, if we look at the first entry here, we have 4 different configuration of objects, and you can see with the yellow star, this is in this case a true label, that these configurations follow the rule, while the ones that don't have a label, like no yellow star, they do not follow the rule. So this is just an example again to illustrate. It links back to the beginning of the talk that different configurations of objects are giving different results when you evaluate them against some lambda expression in the background. Does that make sense? Is this clear what I'm trying to read, how this links back to the initial example? Or are there any questions about this? I can see there's something in the chat. Oh, okay, I just see that someone, okay, sorry. But yeah, great. So basically, I hope the setup is clear. What we have is we have these different configuration of objects. There's an underlying ground truth, which describes which configuration of objects will evaluate true. And people just have to learn this from the data. And I gave some more details again on how the learning actually works. So basically, as a participant, you get an example concept, which you can see on the top left. So you get 2, this is just one example, but you could, for example, get 2 red objects and 1 green object. The 2 red objects have a different size and the positions are a bit different. And now you yourself, you can actually generate a new scene by dragging objects into place and putting them together and just see what happens afterwards. You can press this test button here on the right, and you can see what kind of configuration of objects, what the configuration of objects does. Does it evaluate to true or does it evaluate to false? And based on whatever you encounter, you can then generate a new scene. This is kind of the setup. And in these experiments we're running, we restricted the generation of scenes to 8 different scenes maximum. So a person gets 1 example, or the algorithm gets 1 example, and then there will be 7 additional scenes that can be generated by the participant. And they test each of them and they can see if they evaluate to true versus false. And hopefully, giving this learning procedure, they can actually learn what the underlying ground truth is. If that's clear, hopefully it also makes sense then that we would ask them to then generalize to unknown new scenes to kind of figure out whether they got the concept. So that's one part of the experiment, which you can see in the lower part. So they have this learning phase where they go through 8 different scenes, they generate and they get labels. So it's a classified training set. And then they get a new data set where they have to assign labels themselves based on what they believe the underlying ground truth is. In this example, It could be something that there's, I actually just randomly made this up, but whatever you think might be the ground truth. And then finally, and that's the most crucial part, we asked them to provide in English language a guess of what they believe the concept is. So if I look at the scene again, maybe I believe the underlying ground truth is that there exists something red. As a participant, I can now write this down in the experiment, and we as experimenters then later can take this English statement and translate it into lambda abstraction. So we actually have a way to get formal language input from people. That was the kind of contribution of this experiment. And that's everything about the task pretty much. The only thing that happens then is that people basically revise the whole procedure. Oh, sorry, I have another example here I forgot about. Again, this is just something I had on previous slide, but in this example, a participant could, for example, say there exists something red. And then on the right, we would have the lambda expression for this. So the experiments we are running, we run multiple, but the ones that I'm focusing on here is 2 different experiments. One is solo learning. So what I just showed you is what the participants did. And then they just repeated the whole procedure with additional learning data, and then they provided a revised guess. So basically, you have an initial learning phase, you provide an initial guess, and then you can do the same thing again to improve your initial guess. So you get the chance to generate additional data points, and then provide a revised guess in English language. So basically, if we look back at this here, this is something that would appear twice to the participant. Only the second time they have new data they generated. So we get 2 measurements. That's very important. We get an initial guess and initial generalizations, and then we have another learning phase, and then we get another guess in another set of generalizations. And then we have a second experiment, which is not too important for the present talk, but basically we had 2 players playing the same at the same time, and we were just interested in whether this would change something about how people learn compared to when they learn by themselves. But this is something I'm not going to focus too much on in this talk. However, it's something that's reported in the paper. Any questions about the experimental setup? Okay, yeah, please interrupt me if something is confusing or so, because I've been working with this task for a while, so it might be intuitive for me, but not for the audience. So that's why I appreciate any interruption. I don't worry about this too much. This is just our concept grammar in this context. So what it summarizes is basically we need to have a grammar that can express anything relevant to the task. So if we think about this again, what we have is we have triangles that can have different colors. You can see there on the bottom. In our case, they could be blue, red, and green. They can take different sizes, different orientations. And then we also have some other properties which are not too relevant for now. But basically the way this symbolic construct inference and generation works in this here is that you just need to come up with some grammar that can express everything you want to express. And I think we don't need to worry about anything else, but it's pretty much you just need to have a way to write this down. And for anyone that's interested in more details, it's explained in the paper in quite some length. These are the rules that we tested in the task. So on the left, you can see the English language description. One rule was something that came up a lot already, is that there exists a red object. So any scene with a single red object would evaluate to true. That was the ground truth. Another rule people had to learn was that there's no object that is upright. Yet another one is that there is exactly one blue. And then we had 2 other rules, which include an or and and operator, which again, I wouldn't worry for now because they were a bit more complicated. But again, this table is also in here just to highlight how the approach works. Basically, you have English language, you have a translation towards lambda abstraction, which then allows you to come up with a derivation probability for this expression. So what's the probability that someone came up with this concept? And then you can use this expression and evaluate it against a set of scenes to get a likelihood for this expression. And this again allows you to compare different expressions. That's what I was trying to point to in the beginning of the talk. You already looked at this? Okay, great. So yeah, now this is the time for me to just introduce our actual model. So what was it that we were comparing in this context? And this might be familiar to some of the AI people. But basically, I'm now just focusing on the intuition. I'm not going into too much technical details anymore, but the idea is basically, because we had 2 measurements where we collect generalizations and initial guesses from people, what the goal of our model comparison was to understand how, given the initial guess from a participant and their initial generalizations, how can we find their second guess and the second set of generalizations? Like, how can we bridge these two? How can we take the initial guess? I think I have an example on the next slide, for example, that there was something red. And then if the second guess was there's exactly one red, how can we describe this transition? That was pretty much the key target of our modeling comparison. And that's actually quite a tricky thing, because now we go back to the beginning of the talk, the computation level, for example. One obvious choice would be to just say, I normatively generate all possible concepts and arrive at the right concept, at the right solution. However, this might actually not match the behavior of the participant. So we were very interested in this algorithmic kind of idea. What's the underlying mechanism that links the initial guess to the second guess, given the new data? And from now on, again, I'm just going to give some intuitions of the different models. So one is the normative baseline Bayesian model we're having here, which basically just says, given the initial guess, the second guess is generated with no dependence on the initial guess. We just come up with all possible concepts we can, filter them given the new data, and we arrive at a perfect solution. This is just a baseline benchmark for comparison. This is nothing we think people do. Another one is a quite famous one from machine learning. It's called win-stay-lose sample. Maybe some of you have heard about this algorithm. This one would predict an all or non-dependence between your initial and revised guess, in a sense that if your initial guess is good, given your data, you stick with it. Otherwise, you do normative inference again from scratch, and you will get a sample that is not dependent. And then we have two other algorithms, which are more local and more graded, in the sense that they start with a concept, the initial guess from a person. I gave an example here. So for example, imagine that you initially wrote down that there exists a red object. Your next guess could be that there exists a large object oriented to the left. So there's some dependence between your initial guess and the revised guess. However, this model here, this one does still quite some big jumps. You basically you're free to make huge changes to your initial concept. And then finally, we have a very surgical, we call it a surgical model, which does very minor edits. So for example, if your initial guess was that there exists something red, the second guess it generates can be very similar to your initial guess. So you only change like very small pieces that allow your concept to fit your data better. I hope this intuition helps, but on a very high level, the main idea is just we have these models which have no dependence between initial and revised guesses. They are not incremental, but they basically just come up with a perfect solution every time they encounter new data. And then we have this more incremental models, which are taking initial guesses from people and trying to adapt them given new data. And based on the fact that they're more locally in terms of their edits, they're more likely to be influenced by the initial guess. That's kind of the intuition between underlying these learners. Okay, now that's pretty much all in terms of the theory. I think I've been talking for 30 minutes. Is it okay if I have another 10 and we have a 50-minute discussion or something, or what's the timeline for the?
Yes, it's okay. You can go on.
Okay, cool.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. Cool. Yeah, then let's have a look at the behavioral results. Very high level summary of the behavioral results is pretty much, given that people collected new data in the second round, obviously their generalizations became more accurate in the second round. So that's one key finding. What I show here. So don't worry too much about the details on the right. If we just focus on the left plot, for example, and in just the part where it says participant, you can always see these bars where the left one with the small dots is the accuracy of the initial guess, given that this was the ground truth. And the second one is the accuracy of the revised guess, given that this was the ground truth. And without worrying too much about the actual ground truth, the only thing that really matters is this kind of upward trend, showing that people consistently improved the accuracy of their guesses. So it seemed as if the additional data benefited their performance. And this was not only true in terms of the generalizations, but it was also true in terms of the proportion of the English language guesses they provided, in terms of how often did they match the underlying ground truth. So again, just looking at the left plot, we kind of see, sorry, in this case, not looking at the left plot, but on the right plot, just again on the participant column, we see some consistent upward trend in terms of the accuracy of their English language guesses. Again, it's nothing to look into in too much detail at this stage, but the gist is just you play the game once, then you play it again, you get new data, and you become better. It's pretty much something you expect, that more data makes you more accurate and also helps you to better guess the underlying concept. So these are all just sanity checks. And then finally, this is now interesting because this leads into the comparison of the different models, is that, let's have a look at this. This slide is actually better, I think. We were now also interested in how much people changed components of their concepts. So just looking at the left side at panel A of this plot, what this plot shows is, for all the different components that a concept could have, which are expressed on the x-axis, such as Booleans, for example. Let's just think about Booleans. These are and or expressions or not expressions. So thinking about all these kind of things that can make up a concept, how much did people change from their initial English language guess towards their revised English language guess? And the only thing we're really interested here in is the proportion of gray bars, the height of the gray bars versus the other bars. And the higher the gray bars are, the less people changed. So they were there, which means that their initial and revised concepts had a lot of shared components, so to speak. And if there's a high proportion of shared components, this means that there was little change to concepts given new data. And this is again just a sanity check we were interested in. We wanted to see if we compare a normative approach, which has no dependence, which is shown in panel B. Pretty much everything that counts is just how's the ratio of gray bars between participants, which are in panel A, versus a normative learner, which is in panel B. And if the ratio of gray bars versus the other bars is higher for participants compared to the normative learner, which is not dependent, this means actually that people are more anchored to the initial guesses. So they make smaller incremental changes compared to what you would expect under a non-dependent model, which was the normative learner here. So to summarize this on a very high level again, given that you have encountered additional data in this experiment, you improve your accuracy. That's what we found empirically for participants. And also the guesses, the English language guesses of the rules were more accurate compared to the initial guesses. And then finally, very, very interesting for model comparisons is this last point, that basically people were more anchored to the initial guesses compared to what you would have expected under normative inference, which doesn't predict any dependence. So this links back to the slide where I introduced the different learners. If we think about this again, the normative one just said that there's no dependence at all between your initial and revised guess, but it's all about performance and the concept that you generate given your data. Whereas our more algorithmic level approaches, the regrowing and surgery parts, are more interested in the transitions from the initial to the revised guess. So they are considering the initial guess and they adapt it incrementally given new data to arrive at the revised guess. So thinking about the empirical picture that we had from the first experiment, we were kind of motivated to go on with this model comparisons because we thought, okay, now that we see that people are anchored to the initial guess, maybe we can find a way to find their revised guesses given their initial guess using these different models. That's pretty much the last slide I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to skip experiment 2, which is again in the paper, which is not too relevant for the talk, but it's the same structure. And I'm just going to go finally to the model comparison, which now, in a nutshell, is pretty much just comparing the probability or the likelihood of each model with which each model finds the revised guess given the initial guess of subjects. So again, what we're interested in is they provide one English language guess. How can we get the second one? And how good are our different models at doing this? So if we just focus on panel A for now, again, which is the first experiment, on the x-axis, we now can see all the different models we're comparing, where the TS is this very local tree surgery model I showed a couple of slides ago, then TR is the less local adaptive model. And then we have Winstay-Luz sample, which is the all or non-dependent model. And then we have posterior sample and map, which are just two versions of a normative model. So the map is the maximum a posteriori, which is like the mode of a posterior distribution. And the posterior sample is just the full posterior distribution. So these two models are the normative model, but they're just two different variants. And then we also have H init, which is the initial rule guess from participants. So what this plot tells you, if we look at the, again, just on the left side, on the y-axis, we have the probability of getting the revised rule, giving the initial guess. So if we just look at the initial guess, this has already a 50% probability. What this means in words is that 50% of the times, the initial guess was equal to the revised guess. So people didn't change anything at all. Now, this might have very different reasons, which we're not going to explore in detail, but one could just be that people found the ground truth already in the first trial. And now what we were interested in is just if any of our algorithmic models has a chance to find the revised rule, and actually if this chance is higher than the initial guess provided by participants. And we could find all of these differences were quite small, that the surgical model kind of had the highest probability in terms of generating the revised rule guess from participants. So it was using like quite some sophisticated comparison, which I didn't have the time to introduce here, but it can be read about in the paper. The final result basically supported the idea that the very local adaptive model is the best description of human concept adaptation in this specific context. So not claiming that this will apply to other contexts, but that was pretty much the gist of the model comparison. And we could find a similar pattern in experiment too, but there were some other complications which are also be read about in the paper, but I'm not going to go into detail because I want to save some time for discussions and questions. So yeah, if there are no comments, I think I will wrap it up on this page here. I'll probably just leave this slide open because the limitation section is, I think, might be a bit boring for this audience. So I just want to thank you for taking your time and summarize again in 1 minute the gist of this work, which was basically trying to understand how people adapt concepts in a complex compositional space where you have an infinite number of concepts that you could generate. So now, given that you learned a concept, how do you adapt it when new data arrives? And this was pretty much the thing that we were interested in investigating. And we could find support for a model that basically has a local adaptive approach to what you have. So as you go out in the world, having a concept, for example, that Sainsbury's is a good supermarket, maybe in the UK, you then go to another supermarket and you find better products, whatever. This doesn't mean that you start from scratch again, understanding which supermarket might be the best, but you maybe change your statement to something like Sainsbury's and Tesco are both good supermarkets. That's pretty much the idea. So you have this adaptive approach towards your hypothesis. And that's pretty much what we investigated in this talk. So thanks very much. And I'm very happy to have some discussion about the slides now.
Thank you for this beautiful talk, Philip. It was very worthwhile. Now, if you want, we can take questions from our guests.
Yeah, sure.
Any questions? Okay. Mete Veisoğlu can go on if you want.
Thank you. Hello, Jan.
Hi, Mete.
Thank you for the talk. It was very interesting. My question is about the models
Sure.
that worked, the 4 models. I was wondering if there are why, I mean, I'm not familiar with the literature in this area. So why did you choose these 4 models? Are there any other models in literature that you would like to try? Like, for instance, I don't know, it might be a little too high level or naive on my side, but I was thinking maybe sometimes people also think in paradoxes or in dualities. Like sometimes people swing from one end to the other and then eventually end up somewhere around the middle point. Like, you see my point? So I was wondering.
Yeah, no, I think so. Yeah. No, it's a great point. And to be honest, I can only criticize this work myself for not doing that. The thing is, it's quite a complex thing to translate the data in this task into actual some grammar that works, right? So just this kind of surgical edits implementing this is quite of a challenging programming problem. So I'm aware of the fact that we didn't account for this kind of going forth and back between concepts. What we always just look at the endpoint of an algorithmic procedure. So it's definitely a good point. One thing I could think of is that you have, during your search, you have different time points where you stop searching and then you can see where you are. And then you want to see if you go back to something like you just said that you swing back. But yeah, it's just for me, I couldn't think about a way of implementing at the stage when I was doing it, but I definitely believe that's something to consider. It might be something that I addressed in the limitations. I have something called limited coverage of the local search. So that might be a point that could relate, so that I'm not really covering everything they're doing, swinging back and forth, but I'm just really much taking the endpoint. So that's one thing. And then one other thing, maybe that's something you were referring to. There's something called starting over, which also exists. Like you have something, and at some point you just, okay, I'm just going to go away from that. I'm starting over again, and then I might end up somewhere in the middle. So yeah, these are all kind of things we couldn't account for that should be investigated. I hope that was helpful.
It was, and also like to follow up with another quick question.
Sure.
I was thinking, okay, for some people it might be incremental. It could mean an incremental algorithm to proceed from there exists a red to there exists only one red. But I was thinking what local search actually means, because for some people there exists only one red, or let me rephrase. For some people, there exists blue could be closer to there exists than there exists only one red. You see my point? Like
I see. Yeah.
So, like if you think I'm not sure about, like sometimes you might change the grammar and do an incremental search, but sometimes you might not play with the grammar, but you might just change the I don't know, properties of the object, and then it could also be considered local. I don't know if the question makes sense to you.
No, I think it makes sense. So what you're saying is that the for some people, a change from the exister red to their exister blue might be smaller than the change from the exister red.
Exactly. So I couldn't really like, what local means.
Okay. Yeah. So that's a very good point. In our,
people, right?
I totally agree. So in our case, we define it in terms of the probability, or like the number of steps it takes from getting to one rule to the other, given the grammar. So conditional on the grammar we have selected, we can compute a probability of going from the exister red to the exist one red, and we can compute a probability from the exister red to the exister blue. And using our grammar, the one that with the exister red will have a higher probability than the exister blue. But this is arbitrary, right? It's dependent on what you allow in your search. So local search in this context just means smallest probability of arriving at the end given the start. That's more local than something with a larger probability. However, I totally agree that for some people, these things might also be different. So it's an important point that we didn't address in the paper. Yeah. See, there's sorry, you monitoring the questions, right? I'm not sure who's monitoring them.
Yeah. Okay.
So
are there any other
I
questions?
have. I have. So Philip, can you go back to the last plot that you showed this experiment?
Sure.
So you mentioned that here the initial guesses might be true just in the first trial. So here in these experiments, you are basically showing different set of concepts and collect this data from each of these experiments, right? So yeah. I'm interested in the question of, so what if you basically perform this type of analysis where one dimension might be the complexity of the concept, like maybe one can include just one basic concept, whereas you incrementally increase the complexity, whether this plots will change when we change the complexity of the concepts.
Yeah, so I totally agree, and I believe that this would make it more transparent. In this case, due to time constraints and stuff, I just cramped it all. I averaged across the stimuli we're having, which are the different concepts. But I believe, for example, that if the concept is something very simple, such as there exists something red, it's likely that people already discovered it in the first round, and it's very likely they're not going to change because they already have the ground truth. However, as you said, if you would have something more complex that's more difficult to learn in the first round, and maybe even impossible after the second round, it's still more likely to see a change here. So in this case, the initial one would go down. But in this plot, I'm just trying to see on average, even if I include all these trials where people might not have changed, can we still have a model that beats the initial one? So the initial one is a very strong, actually almost unfair baseline comparison in this case here. But yeah, I agree. I believe increasing the complexity, or in other words, decreasing the probability that people identify the concept in the beginning correctly, will result in lower performance of the H init because it's more likely to change. Yeah, that's a very good point. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions?
So maybe I can ask one quick question. So in defining these ground truth concepts, are you using some relations between the objects as well? So
yeah,
I
I'm going back. Yeah, here. So in this specific example, we don't. However, we have another paper, or like Neil has another paper where they have relational operators. So we allow for them in our grammar. We have one relation which is called contact, which just means if objects have a shared X or Y position. So the way this experiment works is that you get basically X and Y pixel positions from the different objects, and then you can compute discrete states out of these almost continuous kind of relations. So if they have something shared in common, you can compute a contact relational operator, basically. We didn't test for this in here.
Spatial relations, right? For example, one object being left to the
exactly
other
these kind
one,
of things.
So,
we didn't do this in this presentation, but we have the game for another paper which has already been published, I think 2 years ago, and there you have relational operators as well. The reason why we didn't include them is that they are more complex in terms of the lambda expression, so it's a bit harder to define them because we have multiple bound variables. You don't talk about just one object, but you have to have expressions allowing you to include different objects. So there will be exists, for example, will appear twice in your expression. And as this increases the complexity of the lambda expression quite drastically, it's very hard then to do this local edits on them, like implement this in code. It makes it very challenging. And as there was already a lot of hustle just around implementation, we kind of restricted our concept to non-relational properties. But yeah, it's a very good, it's a good point.
Yeah, I immediately think of these perceptual organization, the Gestalt rules, whether you can just converge to those type of rules within this framework.
Yeah, no, you can do that. You can express any relation you would like to that you can express in first order logic. That's what this was around. Yeah. Thanks for the question. It's very good.
So does anybody have another question, or so I guess not. So I think we can wrap up. Thank you for this talk, Philip, and have a nice day, everyone.
Yeah, thanks very much. It was very nice.
Thanks.